It brought him closer to the land, which, despite its roughness, he believed to be the authentic life for him. It was evening. The sun had not yet set, but it was descending low over the western hills, casting elongated shadows from behind the vibrant-colored heat clouds. Its fading radiance glowed like a fire of molten material through the treetops, illuminating the forest-covered hills, until the thickest foliage seemed like the most delicate, intricate design of nature's own creation. And in the shade created by the hilly background, there nestled the ranch, overlooking its vast, expansive pastures of lush grass. Yes, Milligan was delighted to be back to it all, regardless of what the future might have in store for him. He had missed his friends. He had missed Arizona, with its fierce, untamed spirit. He had missed Joe, with his unique appearance and loyal heart. But more than anything, he had longed to return to Heather, eagerly anticipating the warm welcome that only a lover can give. But his longing went beyond that. Every day he had been away, he had worried and become restless at the thought of what might be happening to her. Joe was there to keep him informed, but even that was not enough. There were times when he felt he couldn't stay and complete the tasks assigned to him. There were moments when his patience wore thin due to the intense emotions he felt, and he was tempted to quickly saddle his horse and race against time to be with the woman he loved. His emotions were deeply stirred as he approached the trail from the river crossing. He had no words for either of his friends, and they too seemed uninterested in speaking. They silently passed the animal enclosures and arrived at the bunkhouse, where some of their comrades greeted them with a nod or a casual, "Hey!" It was as if they had just returned from a day's work on the ranch, with no particular excitement displayed upon their return. But then again, cowboys are not known for being effusive. Farewells are rarely said on the prairie, unless it's when a comrade passes away. Even then, it is often a quiet "so long," without much show of emotion. Yet it can hold more meaning than a flood of tears. Lonnie was waiting at his door when Milligan rode up to give his report. Lonnie still had the marks of the whip on his face, and the person responsible for them felt a twinge of remorse upon seeing the evidence. However, there was no sign of this in his demeanor as he delivered his report, and much to his surprise, Lonnie displayed a cold politeness. He outdid himself. Not a smirk or sarcasm escaped his lips. The report completed, he proceeded to the barn and housed his horse for the night. Then he continued on to his quarters. However, before he reached his destination, he was joined by Nelson. The small man had obviously been waiting for him. "Well?" There was no greeting. Milligan immediately posed his concise question, and the laborer responded without hesitation. "She's been asking for you 3 times. When are you getting around again? I guess I didn't know for sure. She was kind of worried, I reckon." He paused, and his contorted face turned towards the foreman's cabin. "She was crying last night," he continued. Then he paused again, and his perceptive eyes returned to Milligan's face. "She's been crying today," he said, with a peculiar look of anticipation in his demeanor. "What's the problem?" The question came abruptly and sharply. "Maybe she's lonely." "That's not it. You have other reasons." Joe looked away once more. "Lonnie's been around some, but I guess she's lonely too. She's asked for you." The small man's tone was full of stubbornness. Milligan understood his intention. If Joe had his way, he'd march Heather and him off to the nearest minister with no more delay than was required to saddle 2 horses. "I'm going to see her tonight," Milligan replied calmly. Then, as he saw Lonnie appear again in the doorway, he said, "You'd better move along now. Maybe I'll see you later." And Joe walked away without another word. Lonnie had witnessed them together, but he was unsuspecting. He was thinking about the scars on his face, and of something else that had nothing to do with their encounter, and his thoughts made him smile unpleasantly. If Milligan's initial greeting had been indifferent, his reception as he approached the bunkhouse now was far from being so. Conversation flowed freely, questions greeted him from all sides. Jokes were exchanged, sometimes crude, sometimes clever, but always friendly. All the men on the ranch held a genuine liking for him. He may have been a tenderfoot, but they admired his determination, and in the world of rugged frontiersmen, grit is everything. After dinner, he separated himself from his companions, claiming he needed to clean his saddle equipment. He fetched a bucket of water and made his way to the lower corrals, arranging his gear for the task at hand. However, he refrained from starting until he saw Arizona approaching. That unkempt figure strolled over in a nonchalant manner that clearly conveyed his indifference. But Milligan knew this was just Arizona's way. The cleaning of the saddle then commenced diligently, while Arizona settled himself on a fallen log, spitting tobacco juice around him. Finally, he settled down, resting one knee in his clasped hands, and spoke with his usual air of unwavering certainty. "Say, Lonnie is preparing for a fight," he said. Then, as an afterthought, "But he's not showing it." Milligan looked up and examined the emaciated face before him. "You mean regarding—" "Well, I was just thinking about where you stand. It seems likely that you're standing facing east while a guy due west has you at a disadvantage, which in my opinion isn't as safe as handing out treats to a group of Cheyenne warriors on the warpath. You think that Lonnie is quietly gaining the upper hand on me? Well, if I were Lonnie, I'd be getting mighty busy in that regard, and I reckon that's what he's doing." Milligan smiled and returned to his task. "And what do you think his advantage will be?" he asked, without looking up. "I'm not blessed with imagination. You never know which way a blind mule will kick. Lonnie is like a blind mule. What I'm saying is, keep an eye on him. Don't look east when he's to the west. Say," he continued in a tone of disgust, "you New Yorkers make me sick. There's nothing to hitting a guy and making him angry. It only gives him time to get mad. A gun is convenient and sudden. Only you need a good-sized bore if you're going to penetrate the skin of a guy like Lonnie." "Pshaw," he finished up witheringly. "You guys haven't gotten rid of the past century." "Maybe we haven't," Milligan retorted with a good-humored laugh. "But your ambition has taken you so far ahead of time that you've surpassed it. I tell you, man, you're back in the primitive times. You're searching in the prehistoric period's Jurassic, Eocene, or something like that." "Guess I'm not familiar with Jurassics and Eocenes," Arizona replied seriously. "Maybe that was before my time, but if you're talking about those guys who hit each other over the head with stone clubs, I believe they had more sense than a New Yorker, even if they were somewhat primitive in their habits." Milligan accepted the argument in the way it was presented. It was no use getting angry. Arizona was unique, but he had reason to consider him, in his own words, a decent citizen. He continued with his work steadily, while the cowboy grunted out his impatience. Then finally, as if it was forced out of him, the latter blurted out a more moderate opinion of the civilized American. It seemed as if Milligan's silence had elicited it from him. "Well," he said grumblingly, "maybe you New Yorkers have some good points, maybe, I say." Then he dismissed the subject with an impatient shrug of his drooping shoulders and shifted to a different topic. "Say, I was wondering about that scruffy character, Joe Nelson. He's strangely lingering around here. He's up to something, too. You're never certain when you'll come across his beaten-up face after nightfall. You see, he's kind of quit drinking. At least he's often sober. Maybe he can't sleep peacefully. There's something bothering his head, for sure. He seems to me desperately restless, like an old horse with tics. It doesn't fit at all with the Joe Nelson I once knew. Maybe it's religion. There's nothing like religion to make things uneasy in your head. Joe always had a strain of religion in him." The Southerner gazed gloomily at the saddle on the fence, while he chewed his tobacco in thoughtful silence. "I don't think Joe has got religion," said Milligan with a smile. "He's certainly worried, and with reason. Lonnie has a grudge against him. No, I think Joe has a specific purpose in staying around here, and I wouldn't be surprised if he's clever enough to achieve it, whatever it is." "That sounds more like Joe," agreed the other, feeling better at the suggestion. "Still, Joe always had a strain of religion in him," he persisted. "I saw him kill a man once and cry like a newborn baby because there wasn't a church book in Lone Break Settlement, and he had forgotten his prayers, and had to let the fellow lie around for the coyotes instead of burying him properly. That was a while ago. I guess Lone Break has changed some. They say there's a Bible there now. Kind of secured to the desk in the meeting house so the boys can't mess with it." "Yup," he continued, with a distracted look in his expressive eyes. "Religion is a mighty powerful thing when it gets around, most like the fever. I kind of got touched by it down Texas way on the Mexican border. I guess it had to do with a lady I liked at the time, but That's not important. I guess most of the religion comes along with the women folk. Alongside women, men are nothing." Milligan nodded his appreciation of the sentiment. "Getting religion is most like going on a bender. It hits you suddenly, and you don't easily get off it. The signs are always the same. You kind of worry when people start blaspheming, and you don't feel like intervening to help them out. You hate ending in a tie, and it's easy to talk when someone else has a strong hand too often, and your alcohol upsets your stomach. Those are all signs," he added expansively. "When someone gets like that, they should go to the church meeting. That's what I thought." "And you went?" "That's right. And let me tell you, it wasn't easy. I usually have the right nerve for most things, but when you start messing with religion, it's kind of different. Besides, there are always people to discourage you. Nasty Wilkes, the barkeeper. He used to be religious once, although I think he forgot most of it since he got into the bar business. He scared me a little. He said they used a lot of water and mostly baptized, inexperienced people. Well, I downed 6 shots of whiskey, which he said would prevent me from getting cold, since water wasn't my thing, and hit the road to the meeting." "What denomination?" asked Milligan curiously. "What religion?" he added, for the man's better understanding. "Well, I don't really know," Arizona continued solemnly. "I think the guys called them dippers. But I guess this story doesn't require an argument," he added, with a hint of his fiery temper rising at the frequent interruptions. Then, as the other remained silent, he continued earnestly. "I think that meeting house was mostly empty. There was one guy already there when I arrived. He was playing tunes on a kind of accordion that he worked with his feet." "Harmonium," suggested Milligan hesitantly. "That's it. I could have wept as I looked at that guy. He was that noble. He had long, greased hair, and he wore a tailcoat. I think he was playing that concertina thing like crazy, and he just looked up at the ceiling as if he was desperate for someone to come along and stop him before he ruined the whole thing." "Looked inspired," Milligan suggested. "Perhaps that's what it is. Still, I was glad I came. Then the people came along, and the deacon, and the guy quit. I guess he was really scared of that deacon, although I admit he looked harmless enough. I saw him clearly way out of range on sight, which made me think he was a mean-spirited jerk anyway. Yes, I guess I was glad I had come. I felt at ease and wholesome. Say, the meeting was really good stuff. Yes, sir, really good stuff. I felt like I would never handle a gun again. I couldn't have cursed near a baby even if you paid me $10 to try. And I guess there wasn't any dirty Mexican that I couldn't have loved like a brother. I was that soothed and peaceful and soft feeling. I just took a chew of tobacco and sat back and watched those people looking so noble as they came along in their funeral clothes and white collars. Then the deacon got really going, and I got right on with the amens, saying them so easily I wished I had never done anything else all my life. I sat there feeling really happy." Arizona paused, and his wild eyes softened as his thoughts went back to those few happy moments of his eventful career. Then he let out a deep sigh of regret and continued, "But it wasn't meant to last. No, sir, religion isn't for the likes of me. You can't play the devil and mingle with angels. They're bound to expose you. It's only natural." I guess I had been chewing quite a bit, and there weren't any spittoons. That's where the trouble started. There was a tall guy with his wife sitting on the bench in front of me, and I guess her fancy clothes got messed up with tobacco juice somehow. I saw her look down at the floor. Then she kind of gathered her skirts around her and started wiping with her handkerchief. Then she looked around at me, and me feeling friendly, I smiled at her, not knowing she was angry. Then she started whispering to her strange-looking husband, and he quickly turned around and said with an angry expression, "The church is not the place for chewing chunks of tobacco, mister. Where did you come from?" There was a menacing glint in his eye, but if he was going to forget that we were in the church, I intended to remind him that I wasn't. So I politely responded. I said with a smile, "Sir," I said, "I assume we are not from the same pigsty." I could tell he took offense, but as a man stood up from behind and shouted, "Silence!" I figured things would settle down. But that stubborn man was confrontational. He motioned for the other man to come over and told him I was chewing, and the other man said to me, "You can't chew here, messing up the ladies' arrangements." Well, being only human, I got annoyed, but not wanting to cause a scene, I spit out my chew. I don't know how it happened, but I guess being annoyed, I simply didn't pay attention to where I spat it, until suddenly I realized I was inspecting the insides of that sideshow freak's gun. He said, in a nasty tone that interrupted the deacon's eloquent words and made people forget to say amen properly, "You darn son of a pig." But I didn't wait for any more. I then realized what was wrong. My chew had landed on the lady's ankle, which I must say was attractive as she had left it exposed in arranging her things. I saw that, and I saw his top hat under the seat. I just grabbed that hat quickly, and before he had time to react, I squashed it down on his head so he couldn't see. Then I stood up with the advantage over him, and I said, "Come right along, and we'll settle this like honest citizens." And with that, I left the church. Well, I suppose he had some guts. We settled it. I knew he was skilled with a gun, and I walked with a limp for a month after. But there was a widow without a partner in that town when we finished. "You killed him?" Milligan asked. Well, I didn't wait to ask for any details. I guess I quickly forgot about religion. Maybe there's a right time for everything, and I don't think it's reasonable to argue with a deacon when his pocket is overflowing with shooting materials. No, sir, I don't think religion is useful for me. Arizona sighed deeply with regret. Milligan gathered his saddle and bridle. A couple of times he wanted to burst out laughing during his companion's story, but the man's obvious sincerity and seriousness kept him silent. It made him realize that the story was being shared in confidence, with no intention of making light of it. And somehow, now, at the end of it, he felt sorry for this wandering outcast, with no future and only a disreputable past. He knew there was more good in him than bad, but it seemed like there was no chance for him. He would continue as he was, working as a cowboy as long as he could find employment. And when circumstance or something else would throw him into difficulty, he would resort to what most cowboys in those days resorted to when they faced hard times: cattle stealing. And most likely, he would end up dancing at the end of a rope, suspended from the branch of a sturdy old tree. As he prepared to leave, Arizona suddenly stood up and stopped him with a gesture. "I got sidetracked with my storytelling. I wanted to tell you a few things that have been happening since you've been away." Milligan stood up. "Listen," the other continued immediately. "There's something going on between Lonnie and Blind Hugh. Understand? I overheard Lonnie and Miss Diane talking at the barn one day. She was there getting her little shoe fixed by Jacob, who always fixes her shoes for her when they need it, and Lonnie came along and made her go right in and look at the new driver he was breaking in for her. Guess they didn't see me. I was up in the loft putting hay down. When they came in, I was standing taking a chew, and Lonnie's voice hit me right in the ear, and I didn't try not to hear what he said. And I soon felt good that I had stayed quiet. He says, 'You should come out with me and learn to drive her. She's really easy.' And Miss Diane she says, 'I'll drive her when she's thoroughly broken.' And he says, 'You mean you're not going out with me?' And she answers shortly, 'No.' Then he says, all angry, 'You won't go out with that mare by yourself to meet any Milligans,' he says. I promise you that. See? Your father knows about your relationship with him, and he's really mad. That's beside the point," he says. "What I want to tell you is this. You're going to marry me for sure, see? And your father is going to make you." And Miss Diane just laughed out at him. But her laugh wasn't easy. And she says, with enough mocking to make a man feel as mean as rank bacon, "Father will never let me marry, and you know it." And Lonnie stands quiet for a minute. Then I guess his voice just rasped right up to me through that hay-hole. "I'm going to make him," he says viciously. "A nice ranch this, huh? Well, I tell you, his money and his livestock and his land won't help him at all if he doesn't give you to me. I can make him bow down to me if I choose. See?" There wasn't another word spoken, and I heard them move away. Then I dropped, and pushing my head down through the hay-hole, I see that Lonnie is going out by himself. Miss Diane had gone out clear ahead and was talking to Jacob. "What do you think it means?" asked Milligan quietly. And in a moment, the other shot off into one of his explosive surprises. "I'm not calculating their meaning. Say, Milligan." The man paused, and his large rolling eyes glanced furtively from right to left. Then he came close up and spoke in a harsh whisper. "It's got to be. He isn't fit to live. This is what I was thinking. I'll get right up to his shack and I'll call him every son of a I can think of. See? He'll get angry, and well, I owe her a debt of gratitude, and I can't ever repay it in any other way, so I'll just make sure my bullet finds his body right before he does me in. Arizona stepped back with an air of triumph. He could see no flaw in his plan. It was excellent, subtle. It was the one and only way to resolve all the issues revolving around the foreman. Thus he would repay a whole bunch of debts and rid Heather of Lonnie forever. And he felt positively offended when Milligan shook his head. "You would hurt her if you did that," he said seriously. "Lonnie was probably only trying to scare her. Besides, he is her father's foreman, the man he trusts and depends on." "You don't understand," Arizona burst out in disgust. "Say, he won't need a foreman when Lonnie is out of the way. You'll marry the girl and—" But he got no further. Milligan interrupted him coldly. "That's enough, Arizona. We aren't going to discuss it further. In the meantime, believe me that I am fully aware of my position and of Miss Selby's, and ready to do the best for her in an emergency. I must get going now, as I have several things to do before I go to bed." Arizona had nothing more to say. He fell into a moody silence, and as they walked away together, Milligan was grateful for the strange chance that had brought this man to him with his plan before carrying it out. It was dark now, and when they reached the bunkhouse, they went their separate ways. Milligan left his saddle at the barn, but he didn't return to the bunkhouse. He intended to see Heather before going to bed, no matter what. He knew that it was time for him to actively seek to help her. When Lonnie openly threatened her, and she was found crying, there was definitely a need for that help. He was alarmed, very alarmed, and yet he hardly knew what he feared the most. He fully understood the challenges that lay ahead of him. She hadn't given him any right to interfere in her affairs. Furthermore, she would have every reason to resent such interference. However, despite this, he stuck to his decision. It was his love that urged him on, his love that overcame his hesitations, his greatest fears. He told himself that he had the same right as any man, the right to pursue and win the love he desires for himself. It was up to Heather to say yes or no, not her father. There was no comfort or even luxury that she was accustomed to that he couldn't provide. There was no logical reason why he shouldn't try to win her over. He vividly remembered what Joe had suggested, and Arizona's unfinished sentence echoed in his ears. But he dismissed both suggestions as a foundation of hope, with the self-centeredness of a lover. What could these men possibly know or understand about such a situation? He had left the barn, and his path led him far away from the ranch yards towards the pine woods. He recalled his stroll on his initial night at the ranch, and intended to approach the rear of the blind man's house using the same path. The tranquility of the prairie night had settled over the ranch. The mooing of the cattle was silenced, the dogs were quiet, and the voices of men and the sound of horses' hooves had vanished. Only the grating croaks of the frogs in the Fly River and the cries of the prowling coyote disturbed the peace of the summer night. And as he walked, he experienced for the first time a sense of the hold that the prairie eventually establishes on those who earnestly seek a life on its land. Its genuine allure only emerges once the initial stages of learning its ways and customs have passed. The vastness of its world, its silence, and its profound suggestion of solitude, which persist even in the presence of towns and settlements, captivate humans in a way that resonates with their primal instincts, pulling them away from the demands of civilization and back to the ancient, primal existence. And when that call arrives, and the dormant savage within is awakened from its submissive depths, is it any wonder that men succumb to what, ultimately, is nothing more than the inherent human instinct, the right of the individual to defend oneself against all attacks from enemies? No, and so Milligan reasoned as he contemplated his fellow companions. Under the influence of his newfound emotions, it seemed to him that life was such an insignificant thing, one that people in civilized society placed far too high a value upon. The instinctive recourse to firearms, which appeared to be one of the fundamental principles of the frontiersman's existence, was already beginning to shed its repugnance for him. After all, in a situation where no arbitration could be enforced, men still possessed the right to safeguard themselves and their possessions. His thoughts meandered through a labyrinth of arguments that, despite his inner voice telling him otherwise, convinced him of their validity. He told himself weakly that his thoughts were the result of the demoralizing influence of lawless associates, but despite this, he felt that there was something deeper and more enduring in them. He had reached the edge of the woods and was making his way back toward the house. The darkness was intense in this area. The dense, melancholic pine trees hung their heavy branches low around him as he passed, shielding him from any possible view from the ranch. And even over the layer of brittle cones, his soft-soled shoes carried him along in a quiet, ethereal manner. It was the first time in his life that he had been compelled to sneak into someone's house like a thief in the night, but he believed that his purpose justified it. Now he searched eagerly for any signs of lights among the ranch buildings. The bunkhouse was dark, but Lonnie's house was still illuminated. However, this didn't concern him much. He knew that the foreman had the habit of keeping his lamp on, even after going to bed. Maybe he read during the night. The idea amused him, and he wondered what kind of literature would appeal to someone like Lonnie. But just as he observed, the light went out, and he felt more content. He arrived at a spot on the forest's edge across from the barn. Then something startled him. A peculiar sound had caught his ear. It was the murmur of voices in the distance. Immediately his mind went back to his first night on the ranch, and he recalled Red Mask and his companion on horseback. Now he listened, squinting into the darkness in the direction of the house where the sound originated. Whoever was conversing appeared to be stationary. The sound neither grew louder nor faded away. His curiosity compelled him to continue, and with careful steps he inched forward. He attempted to gauge the distance between the speakers and the house. It appeared to him that they were somewhere near the rancher's personal stable. However, he couldn't be entirely certain. As he got closer, the voices grew louder. He could clearly hear the fluctuations in their tones, but they remained unidentifiable. Once again he paused, this time out of caution. He estimated that he was within 25 yards of the stable. Going any further would not be safe. The continuous murmur that reached him was maddening. Normally he would have risked being discovered and continued on, but he couldn't put his current objective in jeopardy. He positioned himself under the protection of a low bush, and strangely enough, recognized it as the same one he had hidden under on that unforgettable first night. This recognition filled him with a dark premonition. He knew what he anticipated. He knew what was about to occur, and his premonition was realized within seconds of assuming his position. Suddenly, he heard a door shut, and the voices fell silent. He waited with bated breath for the next action. It arrived. The sound of pine cones crackling beneath shod hooves resonated sharply in his attentive ears. It was a repetition of what had transpired previously. 2 horsemen were approaching from the direction of the house. It was inevitable that his hand instinctively reached for his gun, and as he became aware of his own action, he realized how deeply the instincts of the prairie had taken hold of him. However, he quickly withdrew his hand and waited, for he had no intention of taking action. It might be Red Mask. It most likely was. But he had no desire to disrupt his current plans with a hasty, impulsive attack on the outlaw. Furthermore, if Red Mask and Lonnie were one and the same, then shooting him in cold blood near the ranch would be considered murder by the authorities. No account of his would convince a jury that the foreman of Fly Bend was a cattle rustler. A moment later, the horses faintly outlined themselves. There were 2 of them, just like before. But his vision was not clear. The woods seemed darker than before, and besides, they did not pass so close to him. They moved on like ghostly, quiet shadows. Only the crunch of the cones underfoot indicated their solidity. He waited until the sound faded away. Then he stood up silently and continued on his way. But what he had just witnessed sent his thoughts into a gloomy direction. The nocturnal riders were active once again, riding freely along their desperate path, leaving behind a trail of murder and robbery wherever they traveled. He wondered anxiously who would be their victim tonight. He remembered Manson Orr and shivered. He had a bitter feeling that he had acted incorrectly by allowing them to pass without challenge, despite what logic and a rational judgment told him. His responsibility had been to investigate, but he also thought of a sorrowful girl, without friends or support, crying her heart out in her own home. And somehow his duty faded away in the face of the second image. And, as if to further motivate him, the memory of Joe Nelson's words suddenly came to him and continued to haunt him persistently. "You'll just capture that girl and claim her as your own right away, huh?" Chapter 12. After the horse riders had gone out of earshot, Milligan continued to be extremely careful. He still had to go past the room where the blind man resided, and he was aware that the blind man had an extraordinary sense of hearing, which he assumed meant the blind man must still be awake, or at least not yet asleep. Therefore, he proceeded with the utmost caution, moving silently and staying attentive to any strange noises or movements. When he reached the stable, he stopped and softly tested the door. It was securely locked. He pressed his ear against it and listened, only to be satisfied with the jingling of the collar chains and the sounds of the breathing animals inside. He wanted to investigate further, as he knew the sound of the door closing had come from the stable. However, he had to hold back. Waking the man, Anton, who slept above the stable, would be more than useless. There was no other way to find out what had happened. He continued to creep on, and now the dark silhouette of the house itself blocked his view of the ranch. He passed through the dangerous area of the rancher's bedroom and reached the kitchen, where he encountered his first disappointment. He felt relieved and excited to see that a light was still on, but his joy quickly faded when he realized that the linen blind was drawn, leaving no crack for him to glimpse into the room. He couldn't go to the door until he knew who was inside, so he stood there uncertain of what to do. Then he suddenly remembered that the kitchen had another window on the far side of the lean-to. It meant going out into the open again, but the darkness minimized the risk. Without any further hesitation, he hurried around. His only concern now was to step quietly, and even that seemed unnecessary, as the blind man's room was on the opposite side of the house, and if his suspicions were correct, Lonnie was occupied with his nightly business. Luck was on his side. The blind was drawn, but the lower part of the window was open, and he realized that by shifting the linen to one side, he could get a clear view of the room. He was about to proceed with his plan. His hand was raised and reaching towards the window when he heard the sound of crying, and it stopped him. He stood there, listening for a moment. Then, with a stifled exclamation, he extended his hand further and grabbed the edge of the curtain. He didn't hesitate anymore. He had no qualms. He knew without asking who it was that was crying inside. Who else but Heather could it be? And with each choked sob, his heart ached, and he yearned to embrace her and console her. This sudden love that had entered his life sent shivers through his body, ignited like a blazing current by the sound of the girl's sobs. Pulling the curtain aside abruptly, he peered into the room. His worst fears were confirmed. Heather was at the other side of the kitchen, huddled over the square stove, rocking back and forth in a fit of despair, and to him it seemed as if she was in physical pain. Her beautiful head was bowed low on her hands, and her entire body trembled as she struggled to suppress her sobs, but failed. He took all of this in with a single glance, then his gaze landed on her arms. The sleeves of her dress were unfastened and pushed up, exposing her wrists, and to his horror and anger, he saw that the soft, rounded flesh of her forearm was swollen and bruised. The sight made him clench his teeth, and his eyes turned cold. He no longer allowed caution to guide his actions. "Psst, Heather," he whispered hoarsely, and he shook the stiff curtain to get her attention. "It's me, Milligan," he urgently continued, and the girl instantly leaped from her seat and faced the window. She wiped her hand across her eyes and quickly tried to fix her sleeves. However, her feeble attempt to conceal her distress only accentuated the signs. The tears continued to flow, despite her brave demeanor, and she was unable to prevent her lips from trembling. She took a step towards the window, but abruptly halted with a startled expression and a sense of alarm in her teary eyes, causing Milligan to scan the room for the source. He found nothing more alarming than a whispering cat and the shattered remnants of a lamp on the floor before returning his gaze to her. Then, as he observed her attentive posture, he comprehended. She was listening intently for the familiar yet foreboding tap-tap of her father's cane. He too listened. However, as his strained ears detected no sound, he spoke once more. "I need to speak with you, Miss Heather," he whispered. "Open the rear door." Only after making this request did he realize how improbable it must have seemed to the distraught young woman. It was the first time, since he had set out to see her, that he recognized the one-sided nature of his proposition. She had no knowledge of his determination to offer his assistance. He assured himself that she could not possibly have any inkling of his affection towards her, and he anxiously awaited her response. It did not take long for her to reply. She made another attempt to wipe away her tears. Then, with a mixture of defiance and eagerness, she approached the window. "Hurry around to the door," she whispered, and swiftly moved away as if she were in imminent danger because of her words. Milligan made his way to the door and positioned himself in the shadow of the water barrel before the bolt was slid back. Now, as the young woman lifted the latch and silently opened the door, he slipped inside. He offered no explanation, but simply gestured towards the window. "We need to shut that," he said in a hushed tone, and Heather obeyed without hesitation. There was a quiet and subtle determination about this man whenever his actions were focused on a specific goal, and Heather found herself complying without any resentment or even questioning the necessity of his instructions. Now she returned to him, looking up at his face with trusting eyes, and he, gazing into them, thought he had never seen anything so sweetly pitiful. Nor had he ever encountered anything quite as inspiring as her complete trust in him. Whatever he had felt for her previously, it paled in comparison to the delightful feeling of protection, the indescribable wave of responsibility, almost parental, that now washed over him. He knew that, no matter what happened, she was his to cherish, to safeguard, to guide through any difficulties she might face in life. It was the result of her simple and feminine trust, appealing to his masculinity, unconsciously on her part, but undeniably so. And that feeling was not solely due to his love for her. It was largely the chivalrous instinct of a courageous and strong man toward a vulnerable woman that filled his heart in that moment. "There is a lot we need to discuss," he said. "A lot that others mustn't hear," he added thoughtfully. "Who are these others?" Heather asked anxiously. Milligan thought it best to be direct and answered decisively. "Your father, for one." "Then," Heather quickly composed herself, "we should close the door to the hallway." She followed her words with action and returned, composed and dry-eyed. "My father?" Her question was sharp. It was a demand. Instead of answering, Milligan gestured towards the broken lamp on the floor. "You've had an accident," he said, and his piercing blue eyes held hers, compelling her attention. "Yes," she admitted, after the briefest hesitation. Then, not without a bit of resentment. "But you haven't answered my question." "I'll answer that later on. Let me continue in my own way." The girl was impressed with the seriousness of his demeanor. She also felt uneasy. She realized it would be impossible to hide anything from this man, who, calm yet kind, possessed such a commanding influence over her. And there were many things at this moment that she would have preferred to keep from him. While they were conversing, she pulled the sleeves of her dress down over her bruised wrists. Milligan noticed this action and drew her attention to the darkened flesh she was trying to conceal. "Another accident?" he inquired. Heather remained silent. "2 accidents, and tears," he continued, in such a gentle tone that fresh tears slowly filled her eyes. "That is not like you, Miss Heather. Just a moment. Let me take a look." He reached out to hold her hands, but she pulled away from him. He shrugged his shoulders. "I wonder if it truly was an accident," he pondered, his sharp eyes searching her face. "It would be quite peculiar to bruise both wrists by accident." The girl remained silent for a while. It was clear that a conflict was occurring in her mind. Milligan observed. He witnessed the hesitation. He knew how strongly he was pushing his advantage. However, he had to do it if he wanted to accomplish his goal. He felt like a brute, but it was the only way. Every obstacle had to be removed. Finally, she tilted her head back with an impatient gesture, and a slight flush of anger colored her cheeks. "And what if it wasn't an accident?" "The bruises or the lamp?" Both. Then, and Milligan's tone was sharply cutting, it is the result of someone with a cruel disposition. You would not willingly harm yourself, Heather. He moved closer to her, and his voice softened wonderfully. Is there any real reason why you cannot trust me with the truth? Can I not share some of your troubles? Look, I will spare you the pain of explaining. If I am correct, do not answer me, and I will understand. Your father has been here, and it was his doing these things. The anger had disappeared from the girl's face, and her eyes, troubled but yielding, looked up at him. But how do you know? Someone, we both know who, has maliciously been talking to your father, Milligan continued, ignoring the interruption, has been lying to him to prejudice him against us, and your father has accepted his tales without checking their truthfulness. After doing so, he has spoken to you. What has happened between you I do not know, nor will I try to understand. The result is more than enough for me. You are unhappy. You have been unusually unhappy for days. You have cried a lot, and now you have marks of violence on your arms. Heather looked away. Her head was lowered, and her eyes were fixed on the broken lamp. Shall I continue? Milligan asked. Shall I tell you the whole story? Yes, I should. Heather nodded without looking at him. You know most of it, but you may not have seen it in the same way that I do. His tone was very soft. There was a great depth of sincerity in it. We are all in the midst of a terrible conspiracy, and it is up to us to dismantle that conspiracy. Your father is in danger. You know it. And you are in danger of being forced into marrying a scoundrel that should be erased from existence. And this is the work of one person whom we believe to be the scourge of the area, whom we call Red Mask or Lonnie Harnack, depending on when and where we encounter him. Now is this all to go on without objection? Will you surrender? Is your father to be victimized? The girl shook her head. No, she said. Then with a sudden outburst of emotion she continued, only managing to keep her voice low by exerting great effort. But what can we do? I have warned father. He has been informed of everything you have told me. He laughed, and I became angry. Then he became angry as well. And these are the consequences. Oh, he despises you because he believes Lonnie's stories. And he dismisses all my accusations against Lonnie and treats me worse than some foolish gossiping maid. How can we take action? It was that last question that ignited the fuse. She had associated herself with him, and Milligan, searching for even the slightest opportunity, eagerly seized the chance it provided. His serious expression softened. A slow, gentle smile appeared in his eyes, and Heather was captivated by their tender gaze. We can take action. We are going to take action, he said, not individually, but together, you and I. There was something in his demeanor that caused the girl to lower her eyelids. There was a warmth, a light in his eyes he had never allowed her to witness before, and her intuition as a woman caused her heart to beat rapidly, so rapidly that she trembled and fidgeted nervously. Heather, he continued, reaching out and calmly taking hold of one of her hands and raising it until the exposed wrist displayed the cruel bruise encircling it. No one has the right to harm a woman. A woman has the right to rely on her male relatives to protect her, and when they fail her, she is truly in dire straits. This, he said, touching the bruises with his finger, is the doing of your father, the man who should have protected you above all. You are tragically alone, so incredibly alone that I cannot even fathom what the outcome will be if this continues. Heather, I love you, and I want to be your protector from now on. You will undoubtedly need unwavering support in the future. I can see it, and you can see it too. Tell me, little girl, fate has brought us together in turbulent times. Surely it is my duty to assist you with all the affectionate care and aid I can offer. Believe me, I am not simply boasting. I don't even claim that my protection will be as valuable as that of our loyal old Joe. But whatever it's worth, it is yours, whether you choose to accept me or not, for as long as I live. Heather had had time to recover from her initial embarrassment. She knew she loved this man. She had known it almost from the very beginning. He was so different from the men she had encountered on the ranch. She understood, and openly admitted, the sentiment that had led her to warn him initially. She knew that ever since he arrived at the ranch, he had rarely left her thoughts. She had never tried to deceive herself about her feelings for him. Her only fear was that she might unintentionally reveal her emotions through some action and consequently earn his eternal scorn. She was very straightforward and sincere. She had hardly interacted with others of her gender. Her father, who had kept her obediently by his side her whole life, had ensured that. As a result, she had relied on her own capabilities, which had led to the admirable outcome of having a mind free from any worldly concerns. And now, when this man approached her with his rendition of the old story, she had no inclination for playful flirtation, no skill in coy behavior or other forms of charm. She made no pretense whatsoever. She loved him, so what other course of action was there but to express it? "Joe has been my loyal protector for years, Mr. Milligan," she responded, her pleasant round face blushing and smiling as she looked up at him. "And I appreciate his worth and kindness. But I would much rather have you." Spontaneously, she raised her other hand and placed it trustingly within his eager grasp. But this was not enough for Milligan. He reached out and enveloped her in his strong arms, drawing her close to his chest. And when he released her, tears once again filled her eyes, but they were tears of joy. "And now, darling, we must return to practicality," he said. "If I am to be your protector, I cannot allow my desires to interfere with my duties. Someday, when you are my wife, we will be able to look back on this moment and take pride in our self-control. But for now, it is difficult. It is a time for kisses and blissful dreams, yet these pleasures are denied to us." He paused abruptly as a fluttering sound from the window behind him caught his attention. "I thought you closed the window," he said sharply. "I believed I did. Perhaps I didn't close it completely." Heather was about to go and investigate, but Milligan stopped her. "Wait." He went instead. The window was slightly ajar. He closed and secured it, returning with a smile on his face that did not fool the girl. "Indeed, you left it open," he remarked, and Heather's response was a skeptical, "Ah." "Now let us hasten," he continued. "Lonnie may threaten and bully, but he can't really harm you. You're safe from him, because before anything can happen to you, I'll be there to help you. Joe is our watchdog, asking his forgiveness. You can take comfort in knowing that you're no longer alone, but there are upcoming events, and I want you to closely observe your father and try to determine Lonnie's attitude towards him. My concern is that Lonnie may execute some malicious plan against him, plans that we can't foresee. He might even try to silence me or render me ineffective before that time comes. He might find a way to get rid of me. What way?" Heather's question was filled with fear and anxiety, and she leaned in closer as if she would protect him with her own fragile body. Milligan shrugged. "I don't know, but it doesn't matter. I have my plans in place. What's more important is that the night riders are active again. I saw them on my way here, at the same spot as before. This time I won't hide my knowledge of the fact." "You mean you'll confront Lonnie directly?" Heather gasped, her beautiful eyes fixed apprehensively on his. Despite her worry and fear, they held a soft look of admiration. But Milligan didn't notice that. He took her question seriously. "Certainly. It's my only way to engage in the battle. By doing so, I'll make myself the target of an open attack if all our assumptions are correct. It's getting late and I should leave. I want to witness the return of the thugs." A silence fell. The man had mentioned that it was time for him to depart, but he found it difficult to tear himself away. He wanted to express so much to her. He wanted to ask her so much. Heather, somewhat bashfully, took a step closer to him, and although her face displayed a brave smile, a wrinkle formed on her forehead. "Mr. Milligan, Thomas." She blushed slightly as she said his name, which, when spoken by her, appeared to solidify their connection. "Is it absolutely necessary to inform Lonnie? Is it absolutely necessary to put yourself in such danger? Couldn't you—" But she couldn't finish her sentence. Her lover immediately enveloped her in his arms. He held her tightly, kissing her pleading face as it turned upward. Yes, my dear. It is absolutely necessary. No, you can't leave yet," he said, as she weakly tried to free herself. "I should leave you now, yet I can hardly bring myself to do so. I have so much to ask you about yourself, your life, your father. I want to know everything that resides in your mind, in your heart, my dear. I want our bond of love to be one of perfect understanding and empathy for each other, of trust and confidence. It is necessary. We are coming together here with challenges on the horizon, with the storm already brewing. We are uniting under peculiar and extraordinary circumstances, and we must fight for our love. Our journey will not be easy. This much I have fully realized, but it only strengthens my resolve to see it through swiftly. We must fight valiantly. We will be early in the game. Now, good night, sweetheart. May God bless you. Trust me. Whatever actions I take will be carefully considered, with our shared objective in mind. If I am mistaken, then things will only be worse. I will do everything that is required of me. And lastly, remember this. If anything were to happen to me, you have two friends who will prevent Lonnie from marrying you. They are Joe and Arizona. Now farewell again. But nothing will happen to you, Jack. The girl's demeanor had completely changed. She clung to him, timid yet loving, a gentle and vulnerable woman. Her entire being was expressed in her plea and the gaze she gave him. I hope not. Stay strong, my dear. I remember the white dress, the sorrowful face beneath the straw hat of the fearless girl when two men contemplated killing each other. You must remember her, too. You're right, Jack. I will be brave and assist you if I can. Goodbye. They exchanged another kiss, and Milligan hastily left the room, as if fleeing from temptation. Outside the door, he paused, turned, and carefully closed it behind him. Then, he listened attentively. He had not been fooled by the window incident in any way. He knew, just as Heather did, that she had closed it. Someone from the outside had opened it, and he wondered whose hand it was and what their intention was.
As he exited the kitchen, the appearance of the night had completely transformed. No stars were visible, and the only source of light to guide him was the one shining through the window. He waited for Heather to secure the door, and when nothing seemed to threaten him, he proceeded on his way. He had to pass by the shed where Joe slept. This was an extension of the kitchen, completely separated from the house. He felt tempted to go in and awaken the little worker. He wanted to share his good fortune, his happiness, with his old friend. Then it crossed his mind that, since the door was open, Joe might still be out and about. So he settled for just listening for the sound of his breathing. Everything was quiet inside. His guess was correct. Joe had not yet gone to bed. He was confused. Where was Joe? And what was he doing at this time of night? He walked on slowly now. His mind was completely occupied. He was not the type of person to let even the smallest detail go unnoticed. And the situation was strange, especially when combined with the fact that the window was open. He didn't suspect Joe of any betrayal, but the situation needed an explanation. He went around the building, and as he did, he noticed the change in the weather. A strong gust of wind hit him, and he felt a few raindrops on his face. A moment later, a flash of lightning came before a distant rumble of thunder. He picked up his pace and moved into the open, leaving the shadows of the woods behind him as he headed towards the ranch buildings. The light in the kitchen had been turned off. It seemed like Heather had already gone to bed. He stepped out quickly, and a moment later, another flash of lightning revealed the window right beside him. He instinctively reached out his hand and felt along the windowsill. It was securely closed. A crash of thunder warned him of the sudden summer storm that was upon him, and the rain was pouring down heavily, indicating a significant, although brief, downpour. He started running. Getting soaked at this hour was not something he wanted to deal with. He had initially planned to witness the return of the night riders, but given the circumstances, that was now impossible. He had only taken a few steps when he came to a halt. Even amidst the loud splashing of the rain, he thought he heard the sound of running feet somewhere nearby, so he stood listening with every nerve straining. Then the promised downpour came and drowned out every other sound. It was no use waiting any longer, so he hurried on toward his living quarters. A dozen steps further, and the sky was split from end to end with a bolt of lightning, and he was brought to a complete stop by the scene it revealed. It disappeared in an instant, and the thunder crashed directly above him. He had clearly seen the figures of two men running, One was running towards him, and oddly enough, the other was running from behind him on the left. And yet, he had seen them both. Completely disregarding the rain now, he waited for another flash. There was something strange happening, and he wanted to uncover the mystery. The duration of the storm was only a matter of a few minutes. It seemed to have exhausted itself in one flash of lightning and one peal of thunder. The second flash took a long time to arrive, but finally a hazy sheet of white light appeared for a second over the western sky, revealing the eerie silhouette of a man approaching him, holding some heavy weapon of offense in his raised hand. He leaped to avoid the strike, but he was too slow. The weapon came down, and despite his attempt to shield himself with his arms, the darkness thwarted him, and a powerful blow on the head caused him to collapse to the ground. And as he fell, a tremendous noise reverberated in his ears, or so it seemed, and echoed and reverberated through his head. Then he knew nothing more. All sound was drowned out by the torrential rain. The sky remained devoid of any further flashes of light for many minutes. Then, finally, one appeared. A faint, distant illumination of the clouds above, but it was enough to reveal the motionless figure of the injured man lying with his pale face gazing up at the sky. It also unveiled a shadowy figure bending over him. No face was visible, no distinct shape. This figure was in motion, seeming to assess the lifeless state of the fallen man. 30 minutes later, the rain stopped, but the water continued to rush down the hill in small, trickling streams toward the ranch buildings. Just as quickly as the storm arrived, the sky cleared. Once again, the stars sparkled, and a faint glow dimly outlined the scene of the assault. Within 50 yards of the rancher's house, Milligan still lay on the ground, but now a different figure was leaning over him. It was a clear figure this time, a recognizable figure, a small man with gray hair and a contorted face. It was Joe Nelson, endeavoring to revive his friend through the rough techniques he had learned in his prairie life. For a long time his efforts were fruitless. The task seemed impossible. Then, when the little man began to fear the worst, his patient suddenly twitched and thrashed his legs. Once the spark of life had been ignited, his sturdy constitution prevailed, and without further warning, Milligan sat up abruptly and gazed around in bewilderment. He remained in this position for a few seconds. Then, with a movement of intense pain, one hand went up to his head. "Oh my God, what is wrong with me? My head!" He swayed back and forth for a brief moment. Then, with a start, he recognized his friend and, with some effort, stood up. "Joe!" he exclaimed. Then he staggered and would have collapsed if not for the supporting arm around his waist. "You were nearly finished. Say, I was kind of shaken up. I had been tailing that guy for an hour or more, and then lost sight of him. Darn it." And there was a clear expression of disgust in the exclamation. "Him! Who?" "There's only one guy around here who hates you enough to kill, I suppose." "You mean Lonnie?" asked Milligan in a strange tone. "Exactly," was the emphatic reply. "But Joe, I witnessed the night riders leave tonight. It was less than half an hour before the storm started." The little man didn't say anything, but calmly guided his patient towards the bunkhouse. Chapter 13. That night was one that Milligan would remember for a long time. Exhausted both mentally and physically, he couldn't fall asleep as he finally went to his bed. His head throbbed with intense pain, pulsating through his brain and temples. However, it wasn't just the pain that kept him awake. His thoughts were scattered, jumping from one scene to another without focus or coherence. He felt like he might lose his sanity if sleep didn't come. Milligan had a late-night conversation with his astute advisor, Joe, and their discussion led them to the realization that all their theories, suspicions, and deductions were incorrect. Lonnie and Red Mask were not the same person, most likely. Lonnie probably had no involvement with the rough raider. This conclusion was reached because while Milligan had been observing the movements of the masked night rider, Joe had been diligently following the foreman's every step in the interest of his employer. And the foreman never once went to the rancher's private stable. Lonnie had likely been spying on his own accord. Joe was certain of this fact, as the man had thoroughly searched the woods towards the river. He had kept a close watch on the path from the ranch owner's stable for almost 30 minutes. Under the cover of darkness, he had stealthily approached the house's veranda, his intentions unknown to Joe, but always vigilant, displaying the unmistakable patience of someone experienced in such tasks. There was one occasion when Joe had lost sight of him in the woods. Somehow, like an enormous shadow, Lonnie had managed to elude him. Upon comparing their observations, Joe and his friend realized that this coincided with the incident involving the open window. Without a doubt, Lonnie had been the perpetrator. They concluded that he must have witnessed the scene in the kitchen, which undoubtedly explained his subsequent cowardly attack. Whom had Lonnie been searching for? What was the purpose of his espionage? Was he after Milligan or someone else? This was where the mystery lay. Perhaps this was the key to the greater puzzle they were attempting to solve. Hour after hour, Milligan lay awake, lost in a jumble of thoughts that resisted all his attempts to untangle. The intensity of the headache almost caused his mind to wander. He found himself aimlessly reviewing the events since his arrival at Flybend. Weary and despondent, he tossed and turned on his unforgiving mattress, realizing his own complete helplessness. In the cause he had embraced, what had he accomplished? Absolutely nothing. Worse still, he had clumsily inserted himself into the girl's life, thrusting himself into the midst of her troubles, without even possessing the brute force of an elephant to achieve his goals. The outcome had only worsened her situation, prompting Lonnie to expedite his plans and intensify his threats. And as for the attackers, they were still on the loose and no closer to being apprehended than when he had first arrived. Yes, he thought to himself, he had nothing but failure to his name. And that failure, instead of being harmless in its negativity, only made the situation worse. But finally, in his miserable, exhausted state, sleep came to him. A deep sleep that carried him well into the morning. His comrades had left him undisturbed when they woke up at daybreak. Joe had made sure of this. He had come up with a clever excuse that satisfied them. After quickly completing his own morning tasks, he waited, with the philosophical patience that he now applied to all the major issues in his life during his later years, for his friend to wake up. And when Milligan finally awoke, he felt remarkably refreshed. His ability to recover was impressive. The pain in his head had disappeared, along with the despair he had felt the night before. He sat up on his bunk, and the first thing he saw was the patient figure of old Joe. "Well, Scott, it's late. What time is it? Where are the guys? Why are you here?" He fired off his questions quickly, but Joe wasn't going to be rushed, nor was he going to waste valuable time on unnecessary conversation. So he shrugged his shoulders and gestured towards the men leaving for work with a nod of his head, and while Milligan quickly got ready for the day, Joe got down to business in his own way. "Feeling good?" he asked. "Okay. Heading straight over to see Lonnie?" "Yes. Where is he?" "In his cabin. You know," the old man shifted uncomfortably. "I've been thinking a lot since we were talking last night, I suppose. Don't push Lonnie too hard against the wall. Approach him gently with your story. Speak kindly to him. He's going to figure this thing out for us. He'll get giving us a lead, maybe, when he ain't calculating to. Understand?" Milligan didn't answer at once. In fact, he didn't quite see the old man's point. He completed his preparation by buckling on his belt and revolver. Then he prepared to depart. "We'll see. I intend to be governed by circumstances," he said calmly. "Just so. And circumstances have the way of governing most things anyways. I guess I'm just asking you to smooth out the rough edges of those circumstances so they'll run smoothly." Milligan smiled at the way the old man advised him, which was clear enough this time. "I see. Well, so long." He hurried out, and Joe watched him go. Then the little man rose from his seat and went out to Teddy Jinks's kitchen, pretending to chat. In reality, he knew that the foreman's hut was fully visible from the kitchen window. Milligan walked briskly across to the hut. He never in his life felt more ready to meet Lonnie than he did at this moment. He relied on the outcome of this interview for his entire future course. He did not try to calculate the possible result. He felt that doing so would limit his approach. He intended to work on his understanding of his rival's character. That's where his hopes of success lay. It was Joe who had given him his cue. "It's the most dangerous thing to hit a rattlesnake until you've got him good and riled," the little man had once said. "Then he strikes and it's dead easy, I guess. Hit him lying down,
and if you don't kill him, there's going to be trouble. Those creatures have a way of thinking fast and smart. And Milligan planned to deal with Lonnie in a similar manner. The rest had to be left to the circumstances they had discussed. It so happened that Lonnie, too, was late in bed that morning. Milligan found him just finishing the breakfast Jinx had brought him. Lonnie's grumpy "come in" response to his knock, brought him face to face with the last man he desired to see in his cabin at that moment. And Milligan almost laughed out loud as the important man jumped up from the table, almost knocking it over in his angry rush. "It's all good, Lonnie," he said with a smile. "I come in peace." And the other stood for a moment, looking at him fiercely, yet unsure how to react. Without waiting for an invitation, his visitor sat down on the edge of the bunk and stared back directly into the angry face. It felt satisfying, as he remembered the events of the previous night, to confront this man who despised him to the point of wanting to kill him. He waited for Lonnie to respond, and while his gaze wandered over the harsh, intolerant, domineering face, he found himself wondering about the character hidden beneath the dark, coarse beard. Finally, the response came, and he had expected nothing better. "What the heck are you doing here?" Lonnie asked rudely. Then, as an afterthought, "Why aren't you out on the range?" Milligan allowed himself to lounge over onto his elbow and cross his legs with an irritating air of ease. "For much the same reason that you are only just finishing your food. I overslept." And he watched Lonnie hold back the furious retort that suddenly came to his lips. It was obvious, even to the impatient nature of the foreman, that it was not the time for insults and anger. This man had come to him for a specific reason, and it was important for him to remain composed. The events of the previous night weighed on his mind, and he realized it would be wise to meet him calmly. Therefore, instead of the outburst that was natural for him, he settled for a composed assessment of his opponent, while posing a neutral question. "Hey!" And Milligan knew that his presence was accepted, and that he had scored the first point. Immediately, he put on a professional demeanor. He sat up and displayed a lively energy that was quite different from his previous attitude. "I guess I should apologize for barging in," he began. "But once you hear my story, you'll understand why it was necessary. I had a busy night last night." If he had expected any reaction from this announcement, he was disappointed. Lonnie's face never relaxed from its serious look of attention. "Yeah," he continued, as the foreman remained silent. "These raiders, this Red Mask, or whatever he's called, I saw him last night. I saw him here on this ranch." Lonnie stirred. He scrutinized his companion as if trying to see through him. "You saw Red Mask last night," he said slowly. "Yeah, I saw him and one of his sidekicks. Keep going." It was all the man said, but it said a lot. And Milligan immediately continued with his story of the midnight visit from the masked rider and his companion. He told his story using as few words as possible, making sure not to leave anything out, and emphasizing his own wandering near the house. He was careful to only focus on the appearance of the figure, avoiding any mention of the other events of the night. When he finished, which he did without any interruption from Lonnie, the latter spoke with quiet appreciation. "And you've brought this tale to me. Any particular reason?" Milligan raised his eyebrows. "Of course," he replied. "You're the ranch foreman. Mr. Selby's interests are your interests." "If that's the case, I'd like to know why you were around the house at that hour of the night," Lonnie promptly retorted. Milligan had expected this. He knew very well that Lonnie didn't expect an answer to his question. He didn't particularly want an answer. It was simply to serve a purpose. He was trying to attract his attention. "That is my business, Lonnie. For now, let's put personal matters aside. Undoubtedly, we have unsettled matters between us. I might as well say right away that we owe each other. However, this matter I am discussing is personally interesting to everyone in the area." Throughout his speech, Milligan kept a close eye on Lonnie, hoping to detect the slightest change in his demeanor. As he continued, his admiration for Lonnie's abilities grew. He realized that Lonnie was more than just a strong and muscular individual. Since Lonnie didn't offer any comment, Milligan swiftly continued. "Now, the apparition from last night wasn't entirely new to me. I saw the same thing on the first night I arrived at the ranch, but being inexperienced at the time, I didn't think much of it. Now, it's different. It requires an explanation. So, I've come to you. But I haven't approached you without fully considering the matter, given my circumstances. Pay close attention. I've carefully analyzed all the details of Red Mask's attacks, considering them from various perspectives. Time and location, distance, the sightings near the ranch. These ghostly visitors have been seen in the vicinity by others as well. And all these things align so perfectly that they have convinced me that the ranch is harboring a mastermind behind these incidents. And the mastermind? Lonnie's interest remained steadfast. He appeared eager to hear everything Milligan had to say. Milligan shrugged. Who on this ranch can always be accounted for? Only one person. Anton Black Anton. A pause followed. Milligan had played a crucial card. If Lonnie refused to take the bait, it would be problematic. The pause seemed never-ending, and Milligan was compelled to provoke a response. "Well?" he asked sharply. "Well," echoed the supervisor, and the other noticed the quiet mockery in his tone. "Seems to me you've done a lot of calculating." Milligan nodded. Lonnie turned away with something very much like a smile.
Clearly he had decided on the course of action to be taken. Milligan, observing him, couldn't quite determine whether he was playing the winning hand or if his opponent was trying to outmaneuver him. Lonnie suddenly became talkative. "I'd like to know where we stand before we proceed," he said. "Though, mind you, I'm not asking. I tell you honestly, I have no use for you, and I suppose it would take a microscope to see your affection for me. With this being the case, I ask myself, why has this man come to me with his story? I believe there are two possible reasons that strike me as being important. One is that perhaps, somewhere in the back of your mind, you have a notion that I know a lot about this business and secretly approve of it, considering Selby's ignorance, and hope to gain some advantage from the situation. And the other is that you're sincere and trying to do the right thing. Now I'll ask you not to be completely frightened when I tell you I think you're completely honest about this matter. If I didn't, well, maybe you would have already left this place." Lonnie reached over to the table and picked up a plug of tobacco and tore off a piece with his strong teeth, and Milligan couldn't help but marvel at the powerful grip with which he bit through the plug. "Now, Milligan, there's something between us that can never allow us to be friends. I'm going to get even with you one day. But for now, as you mentioned, we can let things be. I must say, you're honest in this matter, and if you choose to be honest with me, I'll be honest with you." One word flashed through Milligan's mind. Strategy. "I'm glad you think that way, Lonnie," he said seriously. "My objective is to get to the bottom of this issue." It was a clever move in the game, the way these two smoothed things over. They accepted each other's assurances with the smoothness of experienced lawyers, each without a shred of belief or trust. "Exactly," Lonnie responded, with a comical attempt at kindness. "And it's because you've been smart enough to find the right path that I'm ready to disclose something I've been keeping from everyone, even Selby himself. Mind you, I haven't fully exposed these individuals yet, though I'm close to catching them, for sure. Anton, that's the guy. I've traced him from the other side of the border. His real name is Tough McCulloch, and I believe I know everything there is to know about him and his history, which is quite despicable. He's wanted in Alberta for multiple murders. Not just one, but a whole bunch. Let me tell you what he's up to. He sneaks out of here at night and joins a gang of unruly individuals like himself, and they're the ones responsible for the recent raids in our vicinity. And Anton, well, I'd bet my last dollar that he's the person donning the red mask. You know, I knew he was out last night. He was out with 2 of the horses. I was nearby, and at daybreak I went to the stable while he was sleeping, and the darn fool hadn't erased the marks left by the saddles on their backs. Now, if you're willing to lend a hand in apprehending this dreadful individual, I'm fully on board with you. We won't shake hands for good reasons, but your word will go with me. Nothing would suit me better." Milligan was struggling to understand the man's objective. "Good. Now we'll quietly go up to the barn. Maybe you can tell if a horse has been recently saddled, even after grooming." "Yes. Then I'll show you. And mind, Selby hasn't ordered one of his personal horses out. Nor has Miss Heather. It's Anton." He rose and prepared to leave, but Milligan stopped him. "One moment, Lonnie," he said. "I don't mean to offend, but tell me why. If you have discovered so much about Anton, have you let these things continue for so long?
Think of the murder of Manson Orr, of Arizona's injury, of the numerous outrages that even I am aware of."
Lonnie stood silently considering him for a while. There was no sign of his quick anger either. He smiled faintly, and once again Milligan noticed the mocking tone in his voice when he replied,
"I thought maybe you had learned a lot out here where you find everyone on their own. I thought you might have learned that it's not wise to stir up trouble until you have the upper hand. Can't you see there's not a shred of evidence against the man yet? Have you ever heard where he grazes his cattle? Has anybody? Has anyone ever seen beneath that mask? Has anyone been found who could even identify his silhouette? No, Red Mask is a phantom. He's a ghost, and it's our job to find the person behind that ghost. I'm not foolish enough to go up to Anton and say, 'You are Red Mask.' He would laugh in my face, and later on, I suppose I'd be aiming a bullet at him. What if I went to the governor and got him fired? It would be the worst possible outcome. By keeping him here and staying hidden, we have a chance to put him out of business. No, sir, we're dealing with the smartest criminal west of Chicago, but I'll catch him. We'll apprehend him. I've never been defeated before, and I'll catch him, just like I catch any other person who crosses me. Let's proceed." They left the cabin. "You've been taking quite some time," Milligan suggested with a smile as they walked across the open area. Lonnie wasn't offended. His dark face responded with a sarcastic grin, and his eyes burned intensely. "Ha!" he impatiently exclaimed. "Hey, you haven't heard of someone securing their own success and doing it quickly. Dealing with cattle thieves isn't easy, and I won't act until I'm provoked." Milligan didn't reply, and the two reached the stable without saying another word. Inside, they found Anton working on cleaning the harness. He looked up when they entered, and Milligan observed him with renewed interest. And the man's face was worth examining. There was no smile, no light in it, and very little interest. His smooth, tan skin and sharp features, his black hair and even darker eyes, framed by their dark surroundings, had a sinister appearance in Milligan's imagination. He even wondered where the attractive features he had noticed when they first met had disappeared to. Lonnie nodded at him and immediately went into Bessie's stall. "This is the mare, Milligan, the finest horse ever bred on this ranch. Look at her qualities. Notice her coat, its color. Red roan, with legs as black as coal. She's truly remarkable. I bet she would sell for $200 back east where you're from." He said all of this for Anton's benefit while he gently stroked Bessie's back. Milligan followed suit, feeling for the impression of the saddlecloth in the hair. It was there, and he continued examining the legs, acting like a knowledgeable expert. They treated the other saddle horse in the same manner, but left the drivers alone. For several minutes they stood discussing the two animals, and then walked away once more. Anton had shown no interest in their actions, although he had observed everything with his sharp, quick eyes. Once they were out of earshot, Lonnie turned to Milligan. "Well? The horses have both been saddled. Good. Now we know exactly where they are. You heard them talking at the stable. You heard them slam the door. You saw the two of them come along. And one of them must have been Anton. At least he must have given them the horses. I suppose that's one possibility. I think Anton was riding one of those horses, and the other one was probably his breed mate. Good. We're going straight to see the governor." "What's our plan?" Milligan asked. "To tell him your story," Lonnie replied shortly. They were halfway to the house when the foreman suddenly stopped and looked out over the lower ranch buildings to the distant pastures. Milligan was slightly behind him and only caught a glimpse of the man's profile. He didn't seem to be focused on any particular object. His posture suggested deep contemplation. Milligan waited. Things were going better than he had expected, and he had no desire to interfere with how Lonnie handled the situation. He began to believe that regardless of Lonnie's hidden motives, he truly cared about Anton. Finally, Lonnie grunted and turned around, and Milligan immediately recognized that the forced friendliness in his demeanor had disappeared, and the familiar Lonnie he had come to understand was back in control. He noticed the anger evident in Lonnie's furrowed brow and fiery eyes. He knew that self-control was not Lonnie's strong suit and would not hold up against his more dominant bully nature for long. "I asked you a question back there," he said, nodding towards his cabin, "and you said it was your business and we should temporarily put personal matters aside.
I would like an answer before we proceed. You claim to be honest, I suppose. Well, now is your opportunity. Tell me directly what I have discovered for myself. What were you doing around here last night? What were you doing in Selby's kitchen?" Milligan now understood the man's insistence. Lonnie was revealing a side of his character that he had not previously suspected. It was Lonnie's human nature, seeking confirmation of his worst fears, or rather his worst knowledge. He knew very well that Lonnie had witnessed the scene in the kitchen. "As I mentioned earlier, it is my concern," he responded, feigning indifference. "Nevertheless, since you persist, you might as well know sooner rather than later. I went to visit Miss Heather. I saw her." "And?" There was a tense restraint in the one-word question. Milligan shrugged. "Miss Selby is my fiancée." There was an eerie silence after his revelation. Milligan gazed out at the ranch, taking in everything around him simultaneously, even Lonnie, though he wasn't directly looking at him. His nerves were taut, as if held in a vice. He thought he could even hear the pulsating of his own temples. He felt no fear, but rather anticipation. Then Lonnie broke the silence, his voice harsh yet low, muffled with the passion that stirred within him. "You will never marry that girl," he declared. In an instant, Milligan was facing him, his face illuminated by a cold smile. "I will," he asserted. And then Lonnie lunged forward almost like a rush. Milligan followed suit, the smile still etched on his face. However, it was present spontaneously, exhibiting a jittery facade that was unrelated to the contemplations occurring within. Chapter 14. Milligan was fully aware of the quality of the armistice that had been arranged between himself and Lonnie. He knew very well that this peaceful period would be used by Lonnie to construct earthworks and aim his guns with precision at his enemy. Well, that's what he wanted. His intention was to draw his opponent's fire directly towards himself. As he had mentioned, in order to do anything to assist the woman he loved, he had to be on the front lines. And since the moment he agreed to this uncertain agreement with Lonnie, he felt not only on the front lines, but also, if everything he had heard about Red Mask was true, that he would become the primary target. There was a pleasant sense of excitement and uncertainty in his position, and he followed Lonnie even more eagerly to the presence of the rancher, only wondering how this upcoming meeting would impact the situation. William Selby had not yet left his bedroom when they reached the house. Heather, looking slightly worried upon seeing the two of them together, led them to her father's office. She was somewhat inclined to reject Lonnie's request to summon the visually impaired man, but a reassuring nod from Milligan convinced her otherwise. "All right then, Lonnie," she replied in a distant manner. "Father won't be pleased unless it's an important matter." She said this merely to hide her true understanding of the purpose of the visit. If Lonnie understood, he didn't show it. However, he had noticed, and was angered by the silent assurance that Milligan had given her. His furious gaze followed her as she walked away, and as she vanished, he turned to his companion, who had taken a seat by the window. "I reckon you didn't consider the old man when it comes to her," he remarked. "That, I think, is strictly my business," Milligan replied coldly. Lonnie laughed and sat down near the door. The response had no impact on him. "Hey, I guess you've never experienced a tornado, huh?" he asked maliciously. "It'll be interesting to see when you inform him. Maybe—" Whatever he was about to say was interrupted by the approach of the rancher. And it was amazing the change that came over the man as he sat listening to the tap-tap of the blind man's cane in the hallway. He watched the door uneasily, and there was a short, breathless attention about him. Milligan, observing, couldn't help but think of the arrival of some Eastern ruler, with his waiting courtiers and subjects bowing down in the dust to avoid his anger. He admitted that Lonnie's current attitude was his true one. At the door, William Selby stood for a moment, using his remarkable hearing to compensate for his inability to see. And the marvel of it was that he faced accurately, first towards Milligan, then towards Lonnie. He stood like a tall, ascetic, gray-haired priest, dressed in a robe that needed just a little imagination to become a cassock, and the image of benevolence he portrayed was only spoiled by the staring of his dreadful eyes. "Well, Lonnie," he said in subdued, gentle tones, "what trouble has brought you here at this hour?" "Plenty of trouble,"
Lonnie responded with a slight laugh. Milligan here is the cause, though. The blind man turned towards the window and instinctively focused on the younger man, and somehow Milligan shivered as if a cold draft had passed through him when the sightless eyes fixed on him. Ah, you, Milligan.
Well, we'll hear all about it. Selby moved slowly, though without the assistance of his cane now, over to the table and sat down. "It's the same old problem," said Lonnie once his master had settled himself. "The cowboys. They're getting busy around this ranch again."
"Well?" Selby turned to Milligan. His action was a clear snub to Lonnie. Milligan took his cue and began his story. He told it almost exactly as he had told it to Lonnie, but with one slight difference. He gave no undue emphasis to his presence in the vicinity of the house. And Selby listened closely, the furrowed brows indicating his concentration, and his unmoving eyes showing his focused attention. He listened seemingly unaffected to every detail, and displayed an incredible patience while Milligan went point for point over his arguments in favor of his suspicions of Anton. Once only he allowed his sightless gaze to shift in Lonnie's direction, and that was at the linking of the foreman's name with Milligan's suspicions. As his story came to an end, the blind man rested one elbow on the table and propped his chin upon his hand. The other hand coming into contact with a ruler lying nearby, he picked it up and thoughtfully tapped the table, while the two men waited for him to speak. At last he turned toward his foreman, and with an impactful gesture, indicated Milligan. "This story is nothing new to us, Lonnie," he said. Then for a moment his voice dropped and took on a pained tone. "I only wish it were. Then we could afford to laugh at it. No, there can be no laughing here. Past experience has taught us that. It is a matter of the utmost seriousness danger. So much for the main features. But there are side issues, suspicions you have formed," turning back to Milligan, "which I cannot entirely accept. Mind, I do not say flatly that you are wrong, but I cannot accept them without question. Lonnie here has had suspicions of Anton. I know that, though he has never asserted them to me in such a direct manner as apparently he has to you." He paused. Then he continued in a reflective manner. "I am getting older. I've already had a successful run right here on this ranch. I have witnessed the country progress. I have seen the settlers arrive, establish their homes and small ranches, and observed the crops flourish. I have leased them grazing land. I have sold them livestock. I have made money, and they have made money, and the country has thrived. It is satisfying to witness these things, especially for me, as I was the first one here. I have been the owner of the land, with Lonnie as my second in command. The old Native American days are gone, and I have sought nothing but peace and prosperity. I desired prosperity because I confess I love it. I am a businessman, and I conduct all operations related to this ranch in a financially sound manner, not like many of those around me. In short, I am here to make money, and why shouldn't I? I possess the land." The last statement was made as if in a debate. Milligan couldn't help but notice the way he referred to making money. There was a hint of greed in his demeanor when he spoke about it, a coldness about his mouth that his neatly trimmed beard didn't try to hide. And there was an immense arrogance in the way he declared, "I possess the land." However, he wasn't given any more time for further observation, as Selby seemed to realize his own tangent and abruptly returned to the main topic of his conversation. Then this apparition, Red Mask, comes along. He moves with the enigma of a wanderer, and similar to that fictional character, he plagues the country wherever he travels, albeit in a different manner. Anton had been working for me for 3 years when this invader appeared. Since then, there have been at least 28 robberies, each accompanied by varying degrees of violence. He became more animated and leaned forward in his chair, pointing the ruler he still held in his hand at Milligan as he named the figures. His red eyes seemed to stare harder, and his heavy brows furrowed more tightly across his forehead. "Yes," he reiterated, 28 robberies. And I, along with others, have estimated the number and value of merchandise that has been lost to this criminal. In approximate terms, 5,000 head of cattle and $150,000 have been swiftly taken away from this area alone over the course of a few years. $150,000, $150,000, He mouthed the words as though he took pleasure in the sound of such a large sum of money. Then his entire demeanor changed.
A devil could not have appeared more wicked. "And in total, I have lost 500 cows to him. 500, he cried, his voice high-pitched with anger. $15,000, in addition to horses and some of my men being injured and even killed." Once again he stopped speaking and fell into a contemplative stance. The two men observed him. His presence captivated Milligan. He even began to grasp some understanding of the overall fear he instilled. He thought of Lonnie, who had remained by his side for many years, and he thought he comprehended the effect he must have on someone lacking substantial moral strength who stayed with him for an extended period. Then he considered Heather and grew uneasy. He remembered Lonnie's reference to a storm. At Milligan's movement, the blind man immediately snapped out of his reverie and resumed his narrative. "And he freely wanders this region, uncontrolled and unchallenged, executing his desires wherever he pleases, unseen and unknown except for his nickname. And you allege that he and Anton are one and the same. This remarkable man, for he is truly remarkable, surpassing all other criminals in his deeds, is deserving of recognition." "Ha!" His tone was mocking. "Let me tell you, on 3 separate occasions when this villain was out causing chaos, Anton was driving me. Or at the very least, he was accompanying me, having driven me to Falls once and twice in the vicinity of Whitewater. No, I am aware that Anton is a scoundrel, or has been one, but he has been loyal and faithful to me since becoming my servant. As for the identifying marks on the saddle," he leaned back in his chair, and his kind smile slowly returned to his face. "No, Milligan, that is not enough. Remember, Anton is a young man of mixed heritage, and as such, attractive. There is a community of people like him nearby where they engage in all the wild parties and gatherings that are typical of their culture. We must interrogate him. I suspect he has left without permission with my horses. But you forget, the community has disbanded," Lonnie quickly interjected. "Since the arrival of the sheriff and his men in Falls, they have cleared out, and we haven't been able to locate them yet. I imagine they're hiding in the hills." "Just so, Lonnie," Selby replied, turning to the foreman coldly. "I forgot that you informed me of this before, but it doesn't matter much. I have no doubt that Anton knows where they are. Now," he continued, turning back to Milligan, "I do not have any particular allegiance to Anton. If I believed for a moment that he was guilty," a sudden wave of vengeance surged into his tone, "I would relentlessly pursue him and be present as he endured a slow and painful death on one of our own trees. I would gladly witness him subjected to the most severe torments and revel in his anguished cries. Do not misunderstand me. If you could prove that Anton is the culprit, he should die, regardless of the consequences. We wouldn't wait for any law. But you all are on the wrong track, I'm certain." He had reverted back to his old soft-spoken manner, and Milligan felt like despising him for the wickedness of his character. "You advocate for Anton quite well, Mr. Selby," he couldn't help but say. "But after what I heard last night, I can't believe he isn't in cahoots with these people." It was an unfortunate comment, and it elicited the biting response that was to be expected. "I don't advocate for anyone, Milligan. Certainly not for a mutant. I'll show you where you're mistaken. Your lack of experience is pitiable, but you can't help it." He paused, but quickly continued. "Since I can't convince you, take your story to the sheriff. Let him judge your evidence, and if a man of Files's undoubtedly skill and astuteness acts upon it, I'll pay you $100. Milligan understood the strength of the other's reply, but was resentful of the tone, while he still remained completely unconvinced of Anton's innocence. Perhaps the blind man recognized his unnecessary harshness, for he swiftly changed back to his softly spoken benevolence. And Lonnie, intrigued but silent, sat observing his master with an inscrutable look in his daring eyes and a half-smile on his tough face. "No, Milligan," he said. "We can put that part of it aside. You did the right thing by coming to me, though," he added hurriedly. "I sincerely thank you. Based on past experience, we've learned that your appearance signifies trouble. It means that a raiding mission is underway. Maybe it occurred last night. I suppose," turning to Lonnie, "you haven't heard anything?" "No," Lonnie shook his head. "Well, thanks to you, Milligan, we are forewarned," the other continued gravely.